Chapter 1 of Afloat on the Ohio, an historical pilgrimage of 1,000 miles in a skiff from Redstone to Cairo. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill Moseley. Afloat on the Ohio by Reuben Gold Thwaites. Chapter 1 On the Monongahela, the Over Mountain Path, Redstone Old Fort, the Ukiah-Gainey, Braddock's Defeat. In a camp near Charleroi, Pennsylvania, Friday, May 4th. Pilgrim, built for the glassy lakes and smooth-flowing rivers of Wisconsin, had suffered unwonted indignities in her rough journey of 1,000 miles in a box-car. But beyond a leaky seam or two, which the doctor had righted with clouts and putty, and some ugly scratches which were only paint-deep, she was in fair trim as she gracefully lay at the foot of the Brownsville shipyard this morning and received her lading. There were spectators in abundance. Brownsville in the olden day had seen many an expedition set out from this spot for the grand tour of the Ohio, but not in the personal recollection of any of this throng of idlers, for the era of the flatboat and pirogue now belongs to history. Our expedition is a revival, and therein lies novelty. However, the historic spirit was not evident among our visitors. Railway men, coal miners loafing out the duration of a strike, shipyard hands laying in wait for busier times, small boys blessed with as much leisure as curiosity, and that wonder of wonders, a bashful newspaper reporter. Their chief concern centered in the query how Pilgrim could hold that goodly heap of luggage and still have room to spare for 4 passengers. It became evident that her capacity is akin to that of the magician's bag. "A dandy skiff, gents," said the foreman of the shipyard as we settled into our seats, the doctor bow, I stroke, with W and the boy in the stern sheets. Having in silence critically watched us for a half-hour, seated on a capstan, his red flannel shirt rolled up to his elbows, and well-corded chest and throat bared to wind and weather, this remark of the foreman was evidently the studied judgment of an expert. It was taken as such by the good-natured crowd, which, as we pushed off into the stream, lustily joined in a chorus of "Good-bye," and "Good luck to yez, and you don't get the missus drownded 'fore you get to Cairo." The current is slight on these lower reaches of the Monongahela. It comes down gaily enough from the West Virginia hills, over many a rapid, and through swirls and eddies in plenty, until Morgantown is reached, and then, settled into a more sedate course, is at Brownsville finally converted into a mere mill-pond by the back set of the 4 slack-water dams between there and Pittsburgh. This means solid rowing for the first 60 miles of our journey, with a current scarcely perceptible. The thought of it suggests lunch. At the mouth of Redstone Creek, a mile below Dunlap Creek, our port of departure, we turn in to a shaly beach at the foot of a wooded slope, in semi-rusticity, and fortify the inner man. A famous spot, this Redstone Creek. Between its mouth and that of Dunlap's was made, upon the site of extensive Indian fortification mounds, the first agricultural settlement west of the Alleghanies. It is unsafe to establish dates for first discoveries, or for first settlements. The wanderers who, first of all white men, penetrated the fastnesses of the wilderness were mostly of the sort who left no documentary traces behind them. It is probable, however, that the first Redstone settlement was made as early as 1750, the year following the establishment of the Ohio Company, which had been chartered by the English crown and given a 500,000 acres of land west of the mountains and south of the Ohio River, provided it established thereon 100 families within 7 years. Redstone Old Fort, the name had references to the aboriginal earthworks, played a part in the Fort Necessity and Braddock campaigns in later frontier wars, and being the western terminus of the Over Mountain Road, known at various historic periods as Nemacolin's Path, Braddock's Road, and Cumberland Pike, was for many years the chief point of departure for Virginia expeditions down the Ohio River. Washington, who had large landed interests on the Ohio, knew Redstone well, and here George Rogers Clark set out, 1778, upon flatboats, with his rough-and-ready Virginia volunteers, to capture the country north of the Ohio for the American arms, one of the least known but most momentous conquests in history. Early in the 19th century, Redstone became Brownsville. But whether as Redstone or Brownsville, it was in its day, like most jumping-off places on the edge of civilization, a veritable Sodom. Wrote good old John Pope in his journal of 1790, and in the same strain scores of other veracious chroniclers, quote, "At this place we were detained about a week, experiencing every disgust which rooks and harpies could excite." End quote. Here thrived extensive yards in which were built flatboats, arks, keelboats, and all that miscellaneous collection of watercraft which, with their roisterly crews, were the life of the Ohio before the introduction of steam rendered vessels of deeper draught essential. Whereupon much of the shipping business went down the river to better stages of water, first to Pittsburgh, thence to Wheeling, and to Steubenville. All of that is of the past. Brownsville is still a busy corner of the world, though of a different sort, with all its romance gone. To the student of Western history, Brownsville will always be a shrine, albeit a smoky, dusty shrine, with the smell of lubricators and the clang of hammers, and much talk thereabout of the glories of Mammon. The Monongahela is a characteristic mountain trough. From an altitude of 400 or 500 feet, the country falls in sharp steeps to a narrow alluvial bench, and then a broad beach of shale and pebble. The slopes are broken, here and there, where deep shadowy ravines come winding down, bearing muddy contributions to the greater flood. The higher hills are crowned with forest trees, the lower ofttimes checkered with brown fields, recently planted, and rows of vines trimmed low to stakes, as in the fashion of the Rhine. The stream, though still majestic in its sweep, is henceforth a commercial slackwater, lined with noisy, grimy, matter-of-fact manufacturing towns, for the most part literally abutting one upon the other all of the way down to Pittsburgh, and fast defiling the once picturesque banks with the gruesome offal of coal mines and iron plants. Surprising is the density of settlement along the river. Often 4 or 5 full-fledged cities are at once in view from our boat. The air is thick with city smoke belched from hundreds of stacks. The ear is almost deafened by the whir and roar and bang of milling industries. Tipples of bituminous coal shafts are ever in sight, begrimed scaffolds of wood and iron arranged for dumping the product of the mines into both barges and railway cars. Either bank is lined with railways, in sight of which we shall almost continually float all the way down to Cairo, nearly 1,100 miles away. At each tipple is a miner's hamlet, a row of cottages or huts, cast in a common mould, either unpainted, or bedaubed with that cheap, ugly red with which one is familiar in railway bridges and rural barns. Sometimes these huts, though in the mass dreary enough, are kept in neat repair, but often are they sadly out of elbows. Pigs and children promiscuously at their doors, paneless sash stuffed with rags, unsightly litter strewn around, misery stamped on every feature of the homeless tenements. Dreariest of all is a deserted mining village, and there are many such, the shaft having been worked out, or an unquenchable subterranean fire left to smolder in neglect. Here the tipple has fallen into creaking decrepitude, the cabins are without windows or doors. These, having been taken to some newer hamlet, ridge poles are sunken, chimneys tottering, soot covers the gaunt bones, which for all the world are like a row of skeletons, perched high and grinning down at you in their misery, while the black offal of the pit, covering deep the original beauty of the once green slope, is in its turn being veiled with climbing weeds. Such is nature's haste, when untrammeled, to heal the scars wrought by man. A mile or two below Charleroi is Lock Number 4, the first of the quartet of obstructions between Brownsville and Pittsburgh. We are encamped a mile below the dam, in a cozy little willowed nook. A rod behind our ample tent rises the face of an alluvial terrace, occupied by a grain field, running back for 100 yards to the hills, at the base of which is a railway track. Across the river, here some 250 yards wide, the dark, rocky bluffs, slashed with numerous ravines, ascend sharply from the flood. At the quarried base, a wagon road and the customary railway, and upon the stony beach, 2 or 3 rough shelter tents, housing the Black Diamond Brass Band of Monongahela City, out on a week's picnic to while away the period of the strike. It was 7 o'clock when we struck camp, and our frugal repast was finished by lantern light. The sun sets early in this narrow trough through the foothills of the Laurel Range. McKeesport, Pennsylvania, Saturday, May 5th. Out there on the beach near Charleroi, with the sail for an awning, Pilgrim had been converted into a boudoir for the doctor, who, snuggled in his sleeping bag, emitted an occasional snore. Echoes from the land of Nod. W and our boy of 10 summers, on their canvas folding cots, were peacefully oblivious of the noises of the night, and needed the kiss of dawn to rouse them. But for me, always a light sleeper, and as yet unused to our airy bedroom, the crickets chirruped through the long watches. 2 or 3 freighters passed in the night, with monotonous swish, swish, and swelling wake. It arouses something akin to awe, this passage of a steamer's wake upon the beach, a dozen feet from the door of one's tent. First the water is sucked down, leaving for a moment a wet streak of sand or gravel, a dozen feet in width. In quick succession come heavy, booming waves, running at an acute angle with the shore, breaking at once into angry foam, and wasting themselves far up on the strand, for a few moments making bedlam with any driftwood which chances to have made lodgment there. When suddenly awakened by this boisterous turmoil, the first thought is that a dam has broken and a flood is at hand, but by the time you rise upon your elbow the scurrying uproar lessens, and gradually dies away along a more distant shore. We were slow in getting off this morning. but the dense fog had been loath to lift, and at first the stove smoked badly, until we discovered and removed the source of trouble. This stove is an ingenious contrivance of the doctor's, a box of sheet iron, of slight weight, so arranged as to be folded into an incredibly small space, a vast improvement for cooking purposes over an open campfire, which Pilgrim's crew know, from long experience in far distant fields, to be a vexation to eyes and soul. Coaling hamlets, more or less deserted, were frequent this morning, unpainted, windowless, ragged wrecks. At the inhabited mining villages, either close to the strand or well up on hillside ledges, idle men were everywhere about. Women and boys and girls were stockingless and shoeless, and often dirty to a degree, but when conversed with, we found them independent, respectful, and self-respecting folk. Occasionally I would, for the mere sake of meeting these workaday brothers of ours, with canteen slung on shoulder, climb the steep flight of stairs cut in the clay bank, and on reaching the terrace, inquire for drinking water, talking familiarly with the folk who came to meet me at the well curb. There are old-fashioned Dutch ovens in nearly every yard, a few chickens, and often a shed for the cow that is off on her daily climb over the neighboring hills. Through the black pall of shale, a few vegetables struggle feebly to the light. In the corners of the palings are hollyhocks and 4 o'clocks, and on window sills rows of battered tin cans, resplendent in blue and yellow labels, are the homes of verbenas and geraniums in sickly bloom. Now and then a back door in the dreary block is distinguished by an arbored trellis bearing a grapevine, and furnishing for the weary housewife a shady kitchen al fresco. As a rule, however, there is little attempt to better the homeless shelter furnished by the corporation. We restocked with provisions at Monongahela City, a smart, newish town, and at Elizabeth, old and dingy. It was at Elizabeth, then Elizabethtown, that travelers from the eastern states, over the old Philadelphia road, chiefly took boat for the Ohio, the Virginians still clinging to Redstone as the terminus of the Braddock road. Elizabethtown, in flatboat days, was the seat of a considerable boat-building industry, its yards, in time, turning out steamboats for the New Orleans trade, and even sea-going sailing craft. But today, coal barges are the principal output of her decaying shipyards. By this time, the duties of our little ship's company are well defined. W supervises the cuisine, most important of all offices. The doctor is chief navigator, assistant cook, and hewer of wood. It falls to my lot to purchase supplies, to be carrier of water, to pitch tent and make beds, and, while breakfast is being cooked, to dismantle the camp, and, so far as may be, to repack Pilgrim. The boy collects driftwood, wipes dishes, and helps at what he can, while all hands row or paddle through the livelong day, as whim or need dictates. Lock number 3 at Walton necessitated a portage of the load over the left bank. It is a steep, rocky climb, and the descent on the lower side, strewn with stone chips, destructive to shoe leather. The doctor and I let Pilgrim herself down with a long rope over a shallow spot in the apron of the dam. At 6 o'clock, a camping ground for the night became desirable. We were fortunate last evening to find a bit of rustic country in which to pitch our tent, but all through this afternoon both banks of the river were lined with village after village, city after city, scarcely a garden patch between them. Wilson, Coal Valley, Lostock, Glassport, Dravosburg, and a dozen others not recorded on our map, which bears date of 1882. The sun was setting behind the rim of the river basin when we reached the broad mouth of the Youghiogheny, which is implanted with a cluster of iron mill towns, of which McKeesport is the center. So far as we could see down the Monongahela, the air was thick with the smoke of glowing chimneys, and the pulsating whang of steel-making plants, and rolling mills made the air tremble. The view up the Yough was more inviting, so with oars and paddle firmly set, we turned off our course and lustily pulled against the strong current of the tributary. A score or two of houseboats lay tied to the McKeesport shore, or were bolstered high upon the beach. A fleet of yacht steamers had their noses to the wharf. A half-dozen fishermen were setting nets, and high over all, with lofty spans of iron cobweb, several railway and wagon bridges spanned the gliding stream. It was a mile and a half up the Yough before we reached the open country, and then only the rapidly gathering dusk drove us ashore, for on near approach the prospect was not pleasing. Finally settling into this damp, shallow pocket in the shelving bank, we find broad-girthed elms and maples, screening us from all save the river front, the high bank in the rear fringed with blue violets, which emit a delicious odor, backed by a field of waving corn stretching off toward heavily wooded hills. Our supper cooked and eaten by lantern light, we vote ourselves as, after all, serenely content out here in the starlight, at peace with the world, and very close to Nature's heart. There come to us on the cool evening breeze faint echoes of the never-ceasing clang of McKeesport iron mills down on the Monongahela shore. But it is not of these we talk, lounging in the welcome warmth of the campfire. It is of the age of romance, 140-odd years ago, when Major Washington and Christopher Gist, with famished horses, floundered in the ice hereabout upon their famous midwinter trip to Fort Le Boeuf, when the forks of the Yough became the extreme outpost of western advance, with all the accompanying horrors of frontier war, and later, when McKeesport for a time rivaled Redstone and Elizabethtown as a center for boat building and a point of departure for the Ohio. Pittsburgh, Sunday, May 6th. Many of the trees are already in full leaf. The trillium is fading. We are in the full tide of early summer, up here in the mountains, and our long journey of 6 weeks is southward and toward the plain. The lower Ohio may soon be a bake oven, and the middle of June will be upon us before far-away Cairo is reached. It behooves us to be up and doing. The river, flowing by our door, is an ever-pressing invitation to be onward. It stops not for Sunday, nor ever stops, and why should we, mere drift upon the passing tide? There was a smart thunder-shower during breakfast, followed by a cool, cloudy morning. At 11 o'clock, Pilgrim was laden. A southeastern breeze ruffled the waters of the Yough, and for the first time the doctor ordered up the sail, with W at the sheet. It was not long before Pilgrim had the water singing at her prow. With a rush, we flew past the factories, the houseboats, and the shabby street inns of McKeesport, out into the Monongahela, where, luckily, the wind still held. At McKeesport, the hills on the right are of a relatively low altitude, smooth and well-rounded. It was here that Braddock, in his slow progress toward Fort Duquesne, first crossed the Monongahela to the wide, level bottom on the left bank. He had found the inner country to the right of the river and below the Yauk too rough and hilly for his march, hence had turned back toward the Monongahela, fording the river to take advantage of the less difficult bottom. Some 4 miles below this first crossing, hills reapproach the left bank, till the bottom ceases. The right thenceforth becomes the more favorable side for marching. With great pomp, he recrossed the Monongahela just below the point where Turtle Creek enters from the east. Within a hillside ravine, but 100 yards inland, the brilliant column fell into an ambuscade of Indians and French half-breeds, suffering their heart-sickening defeat, which will ever live as one of the most tragic events in American history. The noisy iron manufacturing town of Braddock now occupies the site of Braddock's defeat. Not far from the old fort stretches the great dam of Lock No. 2, which we portaged with the usual difficulties of steep, stony banks. Braddock is but 8 miles across country from Pittsburgh, although 12 by river. We have, all the way down, an almost constant succession of iron and steel-making towns, chief among them Homestead, on the left bank, 7 miles above Pittsburgh. The great strike of July, 1892, with its attendant horrors, is a lurid chapter in the story of American history. With shuddering interest we view the famous great bank of ugly slag at the base of the steel mills, where the barges housing the Pinkerton guards were burned by the mob. Today the homesteaders are enjoying their Sunday afternoon outing along the town shore. Nurses pushing baby carriages, self-absorbed lovers holding hands upon riverside benches, merrymakers rowing in skiffs or crossing the river in crowded ferries, the electric cars following either side of the stream as far down as Pittsburgh, crowded to suffocation with gaily attired folk. They look little like rioters, yet it seems but the other day when Homestead men and women and children were hysterically reveling in atrocities akin to those of the Paris Commune. Approaching Pittsburgh, the high steeps are everywhere crowded with houses, great masses of smoke color, dotted all over with white shades and sparkling windows, which seem in the gray afternoon to be 10,000 eyes coldly staring down at Pilgrim and her crew from all over the flanking hillsides. Lock No. 1, the last barrier between us and the Ohio, is a mile or two up the Monongahela, with warehouses and manufacturing plants closely hemming it in on either side. A portage, unaided, appears to be impossible here, and we resolve to lock through. But it is Sunday, and the lock is closed. Above, a dozen down-going steamboats are moored to the shore, waiting for midnight and the resumption of business, while below, a similar line of ascending boats is awaiting the close of the day of rest. Pilgrim, however, cannot hang up on the levee with any comfort to her crew. It is necessary, with evening at hand and a thunderstorm angrily rising over the Pittsburgh hills, to get out of this grimy pool, flanked about with iron and coal yards, chimney stacks, and a forest of shipping, and to quickly seek the open country lower down on the Ohio. The lock keepers appreciated our situation, 2 or 3 sturdy, courteous men helping us carry our cargo, by an intricate official route, over coils of rope and chains, over lines of shafting, and along dizzy walks overhanging the yawning basin, while the doctor, directed to a certain chute in midstream, took unladen Pilgrim over the great dam with a wild swoop which made our eyes swim to witness from the lock. We had laboriously been rowing on slack water all the way from Brownsville, with the help of an hour's sail this morning, whereas, now that we were in the strong current below the dam, we had but to gently paddle to glide swiftly on our way. 100 steamers, more or less, lay closely packed, with their bows upon the right or principal city wharf. It was raining at last, and we donned our storm wraps. No doubt Yellow Pilgrim thought hereabout to be a frail craft for these waters. Her crew, all poncho clad, slipping silently through the dark water swishing at their sterns, was a novelty to the steamboat men, for they leaned lazily over their railings, the officers on the upper deck, engineers and roustabouts on the lower, and watched us curiously. Our period of elation was brief. Black storm clouds, jagged and portentous, were scurrying across the sky, and by the time we had reached the forks, where the Monongahela, in the heart of the city, joins forces with the Allegheny, Pilgrim was being buffeted about on a chopped sea produced by cross currents and a northwest gale. She can weather an ordinary storm, but this experience was too much for her. When a passing steamer threw out long lines of frothy waves to add to the disturbance, they broke over our gunwales, and W, with the coffee pot, and the boy, with a tin basin, were hard pushed to keep the water below the thwarts. Seeking the friendly shelter of a houseboat, of which there were scores tied to the left bank, we trusted our drenched luggage to the care of its proprietor, placed Pilgrim in a snug harbor hard by, and hurrying up a steep flight of steps, leading from the levee to the terrace above, found a suburban hotel, just as its office clock struck 8. Across the Ohio, through the blinding storm, the dark outlines of Pittsburgh and Allegheny City are spangled with electric lamps, which throw toward us long shimmering lances of light, in which the mighty stream, gray and mysterious, tempest-tossed, is seen to be surging onward with majestic sweep. Upon its bosom we are to be borne for 1,000 miles. Our introduction has been unpropitious. It is to be hoped that on further acquaintance we may be better pleased with La Belle Riviere. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Bill Moseley, Bernardo, Texas, USA.